Welcome to One Chapter, One Thought. I'm Pastor Chris from Lincroft Bible Church in New Jersey, and every weekday I read one chapter of the Bible and offer one brief devotional thought. Today's reading is from the book of Genesis, chapter 14. About this time, war broke out in the region. King Amraphel of Babylonia, King Arioch of Elasar, King Chedorlaomer of Elam, and King Tidal of Goyim fought against King Bera of Sodom, King Bersha of Gomorrah, King Shinab of Admah, King Shemeber of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, also called Zoar. The second group of kings joined forces in the Sodom Valley, that is the Valley of the Dead Sea. For 12 years they had been subject to King Chedorlaomer, but in the 13th year they rebelled against him. 1 year later, Chedorlaomer and his allies arrived and defeated the Rephaites at Asheroth Canarim and the Zuzites at Ham, and the Emites of Shavah Kiriathaim, and the Horites at Mount Seir, as far as El Paran at the edge of the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En-Mishpat, now called Kadesh, and conquered all the territory of the Amalekites and also the Amorites living in Hazazon Tamar. Then the rebel kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela, also called Zoar, prepared for battle in the Valley of the Dead Sea. They fought against King Chedorlaomer of Elam, King Tidal of Goyim, King Amraphel of Babylonia, and King Arioch of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. As it so happened, the Valley of the Dead Sea was filled with tar pits, and as the army of the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell into the tar pits, while the rest escaped into the mountains. The victorious invaders then plundered Sodom and Gomorrah and headed for home, taking with them all the spoils of war and the food supplies. They also captured Lot, Abraham's nephew who lived in Sodom, and carried off everything he owned. But one of Lot's men escaped and reported everything to Abram the Hebrew, who was living near the oak grove belonging to Mamre the Amorite. Mamre and his relatives Eshcol and Aner were Abram's allies. When Abram heard that his nephew had been captured, he mobilized the 318 trained men who had been born into his household. Then he pursued Chedorlaomer's army until he caught up with them at Dan. There he divided his men and attacked during the night. Chedorlaomer's army fled, but Abram chased them as far as Hobah, north of Damascus. Abram recovered all the goods that he had taken, and he brought back his nephew Lot with his possessions and all the women and the other captives. After Abram returned from his victory over Chedorlaomer and his allies, the king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, which is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, the king of Salem, and a priest of the Most High, God, brought Abram some bread and wine. Melchizedek blessed Abram with this blessing: "Blessed be Abraham by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has defeated your enemies for you." Then Abram gave Melchizedek 1/10 of all the goods that he had recovered. The king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me back my people who were captured, but you may keep for yourself all the goods you have recovered." Abram replied to the king of Sodom, "I solemnly swear to the Lord, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, that I will not take so much as a single thread or sandal thong from what belongs to you. Otherwise, you might say, I am the one who made Abram rich. I will only accept what my young warriors have already eaten, and I request that you give a fair share of the goods to my allies, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre." One thought. After Abraham and Lot separate, Lot goes down near Sodom, and he ends up living in the city. But then Lot gets caught in the crossfire of these warring factions, and he gets captured. So Lot is carried off into captivity. One of his men escapes, runs, and tells Abram, and Abraham comes to Lot's rescue and defeats the kings who are holding him. So as they're on their way back from the victory, Abraham is met by 2 kings, the king of Sodom and the king of Salem, which probably refers to Jerusalem. This is a mysterious figure named Melchizedek. But these 2 kings represent 2 types of kingship. So in the previous chapter, in 13, we kind of saw 2 paths of blessing. There's Abram, who is blessed by God and is called to live out this blessing by mediating the knowledge of God to the nations, and then there's materialistic blessing that Lot had, but it will ultimately lead to destruction. And now we see two kinds of kingship, two kinds of leadership represented in this chapter. There is the king of Sodom, and he is just all consumed with the material goods. He is the kind of king that was typical in the ancient Near East, and quite frankly, too often of leadership today as well, where might makes right. It's only about winning and victory at any cost. Ethics don't matter. Materialism is what matters. Getting wealth, getting power, and all of that. Thankfully, Abram rejects that and says, I don't want your stuff because I don't want to be in your debt. You could go around saying, hey, I've made Abraham rich, and then you could come calling and collect on that debt. I don't want anything to do with that kind of kingship, that kind of transactional relationship. But then there's Melchizedek, who represents a different kind of kingship. Melchizedek, as king, first of all, blesses Abram. So here we see that key word again, blessing, come up. He blesses Abraham. In other words, for Melchizedek, kingship is not about himself, but it's about others. The power and the influence that Melchizedek has is to be used for the good of others, not his own self-enrichment. We also see that Melchizedek acknowledges the Creator, the one true living God. And many scholars read this chapter and they say, how could this guy, Melchizedek, actually worship the one true living God? The world was awash in polytheism, so this must just be a reference to, just a generic God in a pantheon of God. But when you read the language, it certainly seems that Melchizedek has quite a high view of God, and I don't think he is merely just saying, well, this one God is one among many in my pagan religions. I think he's actually saying, no, this is the Creator, the one true living God who made everything, and I am worshiping him. He is a priest of this God. In other words, his kingship, and this is incredibly important, his kingship is based on worship. That's the foundation of everything. And so Abram rightly rejects worldly kingship. He says, don't let Sodom enrich me. But he accepts godly kingship. And for us today, although, we're never going to be in the position of being a king, I think the same enticement can come to us, where are you willing to reject the world and the trappings that come with the world in order to receive the blessing of God? Are you willing to live a Christ-centered life, or is your life maybe Christ adjacent, where Jesus is, kind of like he's cool. There's some really helpful things maybe about church, like community, and, he kind of calms my anxiety, but actually turning my life over to him, that's a little too much for me. But Abram sought greater blessing than power, than money, than fame, and he sought God. And so are we willing to do that too?